something to share with others at the end of the session. Now I'm transcribing myself, which is always uninteresting. Thank you for people putting stuff in the chat box. That's helpful. And I should say we'll use the chat box today just to capture questions. So once Maria's had the opportunity to offer introductory remarks, we'll move into a conversation. But I've got some prepared questions, but obviously whatever questions might be in the space from the audience would be really interesting to hear. So just use the chat box, and it's my responsibility to multitask, to talk to Maria, but also to share your questions. So it'll be an interesting test of my capabilities in that respect, which are probably slightly lacking. 76 people on the call so far, which is fantastic. It's always good to see that. And it is interesting how this particular topic has really flown. People have shown a lot of interest. 197 registrations, so it's clearly something that's generating interest, which we need to bear in mind. Okay, it's 5 past, so given this is a relatively short event, I'm going to kickstart. So I'm going to begin by thanking people for making time to join us today. And having said that, I particularly like to thank Maria for coming to speak with us. Now, Maria and I did a bit of work together just last year, I think it was, where we looked at some evaluative work for stuff that we'd be doing in the London Academy. And the joy of that was that we started to riff about measurement and complexity, and I thought, oh, Maria would be really good in a talking systems session to come and talk about that. So that's how we've ended up where we are today. And just a bit of biography, which people will already have seen. She's a chartered psychologist by training and currently the director of the Centre for Interprofessional Education and Learning at the University of Nottingham. She's also associate professor in organisational behaviour. She's got a 20-year career in health and social care, which informs that practice. Which is, you get less time for murder, they say. She's director of a company, I think it's pronounced Respeo. Maria will correct if I've got that wrong, which offers research, evaluation and training services to the public and charity sectors. She develops the mental health outcome measure, Cyclops, and that's been used by WHO and by Médecins Sans Frontières. So on that basis, with that impressive resume, I'm going to invite Maria to share her introductory remarks for 15 or so minutes before we move into a conversation. So over to you, Maria.
Thank you, Mark. What a pleasure to be here. And as Mark says, I think the number of sign-ups is testament to this being a topic which feels quite relevant to a range of health and social care professionals. And looking down the chat, I can see just what a rich variety of roles we have in the room. And I imagine quite a range of experience around how we think of capturing information. So how do we know that what we are doing is making a difference? How do we know if that difference is the desired one? Because that's important, you know, it can make a difference, but is it the difference that we want? How do we also provide evidence around how taxpayer funds are being utilised? And then there are lots of puppet masters, if you like, around us. So we're moving to greater localism, partnership working, collaborations. I think there are a few of you here from the new ICB structures. There's a sense around the need for local ownership when it comes to data, but also what's the national picture? What are the requirements? How clear are they? How aligned is the local with the national? And within all that, what's the meaning for staff? But crucially, what's the meaning for the patients, the public, the communities within which we work? And these are the questions we ask ourselves, and it does make for an imperfect landscape. And for me, there's an important takeaway here, which is a level of comfort with the landscape being imperfect. I would go so far to say that it's a necessary survival tool within a complex system. So being okay with good enough is something that is required to navigate complexity and navigate data, navigate informatics, navigate knowledge capture. Mark gave me that wonderful introduction. It was quite early on in my career that I realized that there was perhaps a mismatch with performance metrics and the on-the-ground reality, organisationally, for staff, for patients. My first job in healthcare was working as a healthcare assistant in a GP practice around the time that the Quality and Outcomes Framework was introduced. Suddenly, there was a different mandate, and a mandate that created, at least in terms of the policy rhetoric, greater transparency and accountability around performance. And there was an assumption that that performance is synonymous with quality, and that quality can be captured through metrics. So for those of you who are ever involved in theory of change workshops, so what's our theory of change? What's our assumption? The assumption here was that quality can be meaningfully measured, and that these performance metrics can paint a particular picture on which general practice, at the time it was around 1/3 of their income, can be funded on the basis of that picture. Now, that landscape at the time, there was a fair bit of uncertainty, there was some resistance. The phrase targets and terror was bounded about. I don't know if any of you remember that. But it was felt that perhaps the Quality and Outcomes Framework is being used as a stick rather than a carrot. So creating these kind of opportunistic medical professionals who, chase QOF points rather than being driven by professionalism and quality of care in its qualitative rather than quantitative sense. Now, going forward to the present day, QOF, and in part this is to do with the COVID recovery context, doesn't form as much of general practice remuneration, but it became largely embedded over time in the practices, the rituals of what general practice professionals do. And, in part to do with new entrants into the profession and medical education. But the interest in that resistance, and perhaps the mismatch between what the numbers were telling us versus the reality on the ground, is what then led me to do a PhD on the subject. And those learnings from the PhD really continue to underpin the work I do around evaluation, around data, the support I give to organisations as to what constitutes the good enough, what constitutes meaningful evidence. So I've had the pleasure of supporting commissioners, delivery teams, evaluation teams. And in some ways, this shouldn't be radical, because as we'll discuss today, this builds on quite a lot of prior knowledge. But it can feel like this really is about a sea change and some pushback as to what constitutes meaningful data in the work we do, as well as creating an awareness and understanding. When we say meaningful, meaningful to whom? Because as we know, there are so many actors and stakeholders in what we do. Some of the questions that some of you who are present here today submitted, and we'll speak to those, I believe, Mark, in today's talk, but it gave me a sense of, we're not quite sure we know what the processes are. It also gave me a sense of, do we feel empowered around actually being able to be more assertive as to what data we want to see gathered and how we want to see those data used. Some of the questions have this sense of, right, I need the guidance, I need the process guidance. And that's, of course, really, really useful. But what we want to inspire here is more of a critical and questioning approach, in the hope that that gives you the tools to be able to assert a position around data which will be more meaningful to you and more meaningful to your service users, the communities you serve, the patients and the public. I believe that takes us quite nicely, Mark, into our first discussion points. Did you want to reflect on any of that or add anything at this stage?
No, I think that's a useful introduction to the topic. As we try and consider it today, I am particularly taken with the notion of being okay with good enough, because I think there are a couple of elements, I think, which is something about, because we work in high reliability organizations, there's an assumption that there's a requirement for data to be even more precise than it might be in any other context. So I think that's important to hold to. The second element of that is work I've done around management myths, the myths that govern management in current context, the top of which is that all is fixable, is the first myth we talked about. The second is that only perfection is an acceptable state. So the idea of good enough in respect to data, particularly in respect to the way in which scientism, but which I mean the way in which scientific method governs the way in which we think about the world, even when we're dealing with human measurement, that strikes me as a critical conjuncture to start to think about what does all this measurement mean, and are we going off on the wrong track? Because we're allowing it to be quite intensely ideologized. We're making decisions about it should look scientific, it needs to be precise, and only the absolute right data is correct in that instance. So the good enough thing I find really, really very interesting, but it's not about me yakking away, taking the airtime as usual. It's about a bit of a conversation about that. So my kind of outlined a bit about where this comes from. But I wonder what you think from your experience, what you think the key elements in outline might be for a possible new paradigm of looking at the idea of measurement. So what would the key struts of that look like?
Yes, and perhaps I will say just a little bit more about where it came from. So the PhD, which was looking at poor QOF performers. So I visited a selection of practices that were in the lowest performing 10% in the first, I think, 4 years of QOF since its inception. And my approach was ethnographic. So this is the study of people, and it is rooted in anthropology. Anthropology is the study of people, cultures, goes back to, say, the 18th century in Europe in terms of when the first kind of anthropological lessons texts were recorded. But arguably, we're all anthropologists at heart. You know, we're all interested in our tribe, other tribes, and what it means to be human. So I took this approach of, say, the post-war climate and thinking about, well, we need social solutions to issues. We need to rebuild. And there was a lot around, well, how can we learn from other cultures? We weren't as connected then. So people would spend a few years studying different cultures and seeing how we can learn from them, say, around medicine and health behaviours. I did this with the practices. I stayed with them, did visits over a year or so, 5 practices nationally. And well, what did I find? Well, for some, QOF did reflect the poor performance on the ground, and perhaps for some not clearly enough. For other practices, it really missed that public sector altruism that the practice, the staff team held dear at their core and espoused day to day in the way they worked with patients. So to give 2 examples, a bit of a false dichotomy, but at the end where the metrics almost didn't tell the full story of poor performance, there were mice running around the GP practice. So I'm doing my ethnographic work and there's mice in reception, climbing all over the magazines, the books. The clinical rooms are, of an appalling quality. The GP partner, there might have even been a duty of care there. So, that was explored throughout the PhD. On the other hand, the public sector altruist, my patient asked me, she said, I have nowhere to tie up my dog when I come to visit. So the GP, single-handed GP partner, spent time putting in, one of those kind of metal bars in cement, so that one patient would be able to tie her dog up when she visited. So QOF in no way could have captured those quite salient stories around what it means to deliver care. And to me, that's incredibly powerful as a way in, as an inroad to reflecting on, well, what do metrics tell us, but where are their limits? And if there are limits, what are the alternatives to exploring this?
We've lost you, Maria. You've gone. You're on mute.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't do that. Thank you. So this new paradigm. So I slightly wince at what I like to call the cult of innovation. We hear that word all the time, don't we? We must innovate. Innovation's good. You only prove your value if you can tell us how you innovate. I'm a great believer that really maybe there's nothing new under the sun, and we can also look back and learn from what has come before. I profess slow, incremental change in the way I work. I know that's not for everybody. But I guess what I want to say here is this paradigm is not really new. We're building on concepts that have existed for centuries, concepts that actually scientism isn't going to capture the nuance of human existence and of human experience. So what Mark described as that rigorous hypothesis testing positivist paradigm, so that lab-based scientific method, it has a counterpart, and we could juxtapose it with interpretivism. And interpretivism, there's an idea there that our reality is formed through how humans construct it. So there's a subjectivity to the way we navigate the world, and knowledge is generated through how people interact, through social relations, and knowledge is in the eye of the beholder. And that is of equal importance. It's not the poorer relative of, it's just a different way of looking at the world. So my alternative paradigm is to give ever greater rise to that different, that more interpretivist lens of looking at the world. That doesn't delegitimize the scientific method, but perhaps bringing those together and triangulating findings through mixed methods, quantitative, qualitative approaches, is going to paint a fuller picture. And again, I'm not promoting anything new from the sense that I've seen this change in commissioning practices over the years. So through my private work, you know, I often respond to ITTs, and there's an ever-growing recognition that actually we do need a different way of looking at the world, and wanting to work with providers who can broker that. So for instance, community relationships, participatory methods, all of those are really coming to the fore as a way of tackling, you know, what we call wicked problems in the public sector, these kind of intractable problems, for instance, problems of health inequalities, problems of ever-growing demand that don't seem to go away. So we can't keep doing things in the same way. So this thinking is moving to this paradigm where research, evaluation, is not being done to, but it's done with. And that's really important. So it's about tackling pre-established power asymmetries in a way where the gathering of data is more egalitarian, it doesn't feel exploitative, it doesn't feel like it puts others under surveillance, but rather is a means of collaboratively learning about the world. And last thing to say on that point, so in 2013, now Professor Mark Ashworth, who is a dear friend of mine, but was my PhD supervisor, and I wrote an editorial about this very subject, specifically focusing on general practice, but I think the title was something like a General Practice Quality, a New Paradigm. It's relatively, I'll try and put the link in the chat actually, it's relatively quick to read, but even though it's from 2013, I think many of those suggestions for a different paradigm apply not only to general practice today, but to the complex health and social care system more broadly.
Excellent, thank you. Just taken by your comments there, and a reminder, there's quite a lot of instrumentalism around data. So there's quite a lot of data collection, particularly numbers and representation of numbers, that can be seen to be quite performative, that people do it because that's what they've always done. There's a kind of routine about this stuff. So I was taken about that, and as you described, kind of triangulation, and from my perspective, the invitation of voice. So for me, the crude reduction of humankind into numbers on a sheet runs counter to my view of the world. Whereas people's contributions to the conversations we can have, that strikes me as how you kind of supplement that and get a richer and more textured picture. And just thinking about ICB is talking about population health, you know, they're concerned about population health, they're looking at social determinants of health, they're trying to rework or rethink the way in which health and social care is thought about and delivered. But then we kind of run up against the issue that the NHS has traditionally had, which is quite a lot of public involvement or patient involvement is quite perfunctory, and sometimes people's voices, they're kind of brought on as a stage army and then taken off afterwards. And it's just about the creation of dialogue that would allow us to not say, we've had a conversation and these are the results, which happens quite a lot. The NHS staff survey is a prime example of that. Give me your numbers and we'll go away and scratch our heads about it, but not much happens in terms of real dialogue. And so I was just thinking about how as we try and work systemically and through that lens of complexity, where the world is uncertain and to an extent unknowable in the way in which we've traditionally thought about it, and if nothing else demonstrates that, the pandemic certainly does. How can we start to recognise that measurement in that context is a fresh challenge? And what might that mean to us as we try and have a conversation about him?
It isn't easy. So it can be deeply enjoyable, but it's not necessarily easy, and it takes a lot of time, patience, and resource. I deeply believe that the NHS can really learn here from charity organisations who have been doing monitoring and evaluation work in far more participatory ways for many, many years. And my sense is that ICSs will eventually, if not to some extent already, but create those mutually beneficial learning environments where we're not in our silos. And then, of course, silos are what create the barriers within participant engagement, so PPI, patient public engagement, service user involvement in mental health services, community engagement. We really should come to it with an acceptance of speaking different languages. And yes, of course, we all connect as humans, but there's a particular jargon in the NHS. You know, you just said yourself, Mark, about kind of, you know, systematic way, systematic approach. What does that mean? Do people day to day, their kind of rich tapestry of community experiences, is that systematic? How can we truly broker relationships with the community? Because I think this is what, in part, this question was getting at. And I have seen good examples of this. To give some practical suggestions, the use of community champions, community brokers can be really important. So these are people who are connectors. They are members of that community and perhaps have a certain level of standing or influence or contacts. And they're more likely to be trusted than, you know, public, what I've viewed as kind of public sector officials. Mm-hmm. There's lots of considerations around access. Well, where do we hold these meetings? How do we get people around the table? Do we have a budget for it? Because what can often feel exploitative is, you know, gathering people's insights and not paying them for their time. That can truly feel like something's being done too. So I think remuneration is important. Time, I can't really need to emphasize time. And often that commissioning cycle, or that, oh my goodness, I've got money to shift by the 31st of March. So turn this around in 3 months. I mean, are we going to empower? Are we truly going to build trust? And what happens with those insights? How are they acted upon? What is the feedback mechanism to the people who have given up their time? And often that's not written into contractual agreements. It's where you've got your final report, might be kind of a week of dissemination. But what do we do post that? Because people will be left wondering, was this even useful? Where did it go? What was done with it? So it can feel really extractive, this kind of work. And we particularly know about underserved communities. So COVID, Black Lives Matter really held up a mirror to the mistrust of authorities, the mistrust of medical professionals, of medicine, that stems from, you know, really kind of quite harrowing historical experiences of extractive and harmful research practices. So these kinds of the trauma memories remain. And there's some great work being done by former, if you like, arm of Guy's and St Thomas's Charity, so impact on urban health, around building trust, particularly in Black communities in Southeast London. Part of their funding has actually gone towards training people in those communities to become researchers themselves. So they're not just participants, they're active researchers. So there's been time and money put behind teaching people research skills to be able to conduct research in their own communities. And, you know, that representation really gives a fresh outlook and insight into what's going on. I think the counter argument is, well, are we actually initiating the community into these, you know, Eurocentric, typically quite white, quite middle class paradigms of learning about the world and knowledge? So in that kind of community researcher model, when do we allow the space for reflection to ensure that it's not yet another way of that social reproduction, that enactment of those power asymmetries, but rather it really as an empowerment of communities to be able to own their data, to be able to own their information, and where it goes. Does that address that point, Mark?
It reminds me, some time back, I had a conversation with a charitable organisation in Nottingham, and they were a job agency in a very operating in a deprived area, and they talked about exactly that practice of kind of getting people in the community to have the conversations and have a researcher go into the space and have the conversations, and it kind of shifted their whole way of working, because what they got back was, actually, what you're providing is not what we need. Because there was a certain denigration of gig economy type work, but actually people were saying, that suits us. We need support in terms of accessing that area. Whereas the charity thought to itself, well, that's not somewhere we want to go. So it reminded, as you talked about the guys and Tommy's example, I was reminded of that. We've had quite a few questions in the chat box, which I'll quickly, no, I won't quickly run through, but just take through. I've got 4 already, and I think some are still coming through. The first question is about that interpretive approach that you talked about. And just a question about its scalability. So how can you take an interpretive approach and feel comfortable that it's scalable?
That's a really good question. And typically a challenge that I think works against qualitative paradigms. So what qualitative proponents would say, because typically interpretive research is qualitative, so it's looking at thoughts, feelings, beliefs, perceptions, assumptions, rather than measuring outcomes. So what they would say is that the aim here is for transferability of findings rather than generalizability. So with positivist paradigms, so when we think about inferential statistics, so statistics that are typically powered, that we look at significance levels to make sure that we eliminate as far as possible the result being down to chance. So we're looking at causal mechanisms. So variable A causes outcome B. We can't do that with interpretivist paradigms. We can't generalize across the population. But what we can say is, look, here's a group of ladies who have lived experience of breast cancer. What they've told us, we can take that learning and draw on it for lessons around similar group of ladies and their experiences of breast cancer. So from that learning, we can transfer that to thinking about, well, what might women need from a service? What might they need in terms of privacy, a welcome at reception, information giving? Why did they think these brochures were incredibly anxiety-provoking, convoluted? So what can we do in our new service to ensure that we don't repeat those mistakes again? So for me, there's an idea of spread, but scalability, if you were thinking about generalizability to the general population, your sample is what we call idiopathic. So there's nomothetic approaches, which are population level approaches, and there are idiopathic, which are interested in a particular case, which could be an individual, could be a group, could be a shared experience. So we're looking at reality, is idiopathically a word? I think it is, through that interpretivist lens.
That's really helpful. It reminds me of Dave Snowden's criticism of pilots in organisations, which that idea that the pilot takes place and then you can lift and shift it, and it just goes to another context quite comfortably, is invariably erroneous. But in actual fact, what you can do is look at the experience of the pilot and draw some learning from that experience that might then apply in other contexts. So it just reminds me that's a slightly different way of viewing the world that finds echoes both in ideas of piloting and ideas of conversation.
Mark, just because you said something really important there, the context, the contextual factors, we know how important they are. They can make or break an initiative. And metrics seldom tell us about the context. So through the lens of realist evaluation, Pawson and Tilley, that really came in. There was a seminal Milbank quarterly paper, and then NHSE jumped on it, and suddenly, it was in a range of ITTs. Can you do realist evaluation? But really valuable approach. It's what works for whom and in what context. And how do we get under the skin of that? Well, it will never truly be through numbers. We need to understand what the key ingredients are that can contextually support, if you like, the diffusion of, innovation.
Yeah, I agree with you. The idea of innovation. I had a fantastic conversation the other day. There's two people that corrected me because I was talking about some work we'd done on innovation with imaging staff in London, and they said, "Well, it's not just a new idea, because that's sometimes a fetishized version of innovation. It's sometimes heroic and individual. Richard Branson came up with a brilliant idea. Well, what did it do? Because what we need is something more complicated." And they were saying it's not just about having a new idea. It's looking at existing ideas and looking for their adaptability and adoptability. So I'm very much on that page with you. And the second question was whether people see data as a reassurance to help them avoid facing the challenges that exist in systems working.
I'd say there's a whole range of responses to data and performance management through data. So here, are people using data as a smokescreen to not have to do more or to do things differently or in an improved way? The literature certainly says yes. So this was studied widely, actually looking at the Soviet Union. And you may have heard of target gaming. So there's some great work, Gaming in Target World by Christopher Hood, if anybody's interested. So he applies some of the learning from the Soviet Union to the British healthcare system and the public sector, particularly in response to New Labour. You may remember the actually Thatcherite reforms that were taken forward by Blair and led to, red tape, rankings, targets and terror, a sense of surveillance. So what we know from the Soviet Union, there's a particular gaming effect, which is called the threshold effect, that if you work to only what the target demands, the powers that be are not going to raise it the following year. If you work beyond the target will shift accordingly, meaning that you have to sustain, if not increase, your effort year on year. So to me, that case described as, well, this is what the numbers say, is very much rooted in the evidence in the literature. So my answer to that is yes. But as I say, there's a whole range of responses. What we also found looking at the quality and outcomes framework is that for some practices, there was a real joy in the recognition that the numbers provided, that actually what they said is, no, this hasn't improved our performance, but it's given us an opportunity to capture it. It's given us an infrastructure. And that's likely to be quite reflective of the kind of measurable truth, because actually, when QoF was first introduced, the majority of practices did exceptionally well on it, leading to the argument that actually is this just measuring what people are already doing rather than improving performance. So I think there's also a benefit to seeing, the evidence in numbers. Oh, I'm doing well. So that's, again, another response, and there's a whole spectrum of them.
Yeah, yeah. I think you see that a lot. It appears in appraisal systems where people have rankings. It tends not to happen so much in NHS. But it used to be the case that people were just fixated on the ranking and not about the commentary. And you see it with things like healthcare leadership model 360 assessments. People want to see the numbers, but at the back of the reports there's a rich textual picture that people share. And so I think that's quite important. But I guess it's important to remind ourselves, if people are taking joy from something like that, it's vital we don't lose sight of that, because so much of corporate life can be joyless. So it's important to focus in. The third question was, is there a way of thinking about the measurement of effective systems working? So currently, most organisations are looking at patient outcomes and data like that, which in a systems context probably doesn't have the right currency. So is there any kind of outline thinking about the ways in which that might be measured, to look at a system and say that seems to be systemic and working well, or there are issues at play in it, or are we just facing a complex world that doesn't allow us to actually track that?
Yeah, and also I think we're facing a real time of change, of course. So a lot of this is emergent. It depends what we define as the system, because within the system there are also various systems or cogs. So if, for instance, we think about an ICS as a system, there is an emergent mandate around, well, how will you monitor your performance? How will you monitor the health of your population? And to me, that feels quite exciting, albeit difficult, but quite exciting to have that collaboratively defined as to what constitutes good population outcomes for my particular population, and indeed to get the communities round the table. We know that stakeholder engagement and collaboration, you can never truly satisfy all agendas. And I think that's part of the intractable barrier to having a perfect way of looking at a system. There are a range of interests and people want to know different things. I think, and I'm biased of course, but the sort of work I do, which is learning about how integration is working and isn't working, is really important, particularly at this stage of, storming, forming, norming. So I'm learning about, well, which teams within the system aren't working effectively as they perceive it. So what else do they need? How can we build relationships? How can we ensure, the usual communication flows effectively? But how can we help develop empathy and understanding for one another's roles and responsibilities? And how do we deal with change and where hierarchies, traditional hierarchies, and the predominance of the biomedical model are being challenged currently? That can cause a lot of insecurity and can affect staff morale. So for me, the system is, yes, there's a population level outcome, but also an understanding of what's happening within the system and getting under the skin of that. Again, I believe that truly this is where qualitative methods come into their own. And when I say qualitative methods, there's a plethora of tools. The ones I tend to use more commonly are interviews, focus groups. You can also design surveys with free text response fields, which can tell you a lot, but we know people are there is a bit of survey fatigue, so they don't always answer those. But also ethnography, which takes time, is resource intensive, but observing what goes on. I do facilitation work as well, where views are captured in more of a live way, where we're working towards a strategy, for instance. So when I say qualitative research, I just wanted to qualify what is it that I mean. So there's a range of toolkits available at your disposal to carry that out. Does that address? One other thing I should say, what I'm learning, and I think what we've known and talked about for decades, is the technology, the infrastructure isn't really yet in place there for ICSs. And I think what I say, perhaps many of you will agree with, we didn't have systems that talk to one another effectively before integration. So for me, this is a real opportunity to ensure that the data we gather at systems level is supported by an effective infrastructure.
That's a very good point. As you were talking, I was thinking that traditional notion of the complex adaptive system, which says that it's multiple agencies, they're all working alongside each other. But trying to fix one part of that system doesn't necessarily improve the system as a whole. And I guess there's a danger if we're looking at data. We tend to do this in organisational settings. We look at the data and say that team's, well, we might say not functioning well, or sometimes we'll say dysfunctional. And so we'll throw everything at that team. Particularly, somebody boring and dull like me with OD in their job title will be sent down to do something to the team. But in actual fact, systemic thinking requires us to zoom out and look at the system, not try and focus on just those little bits of it, which is perhaps where traditional data collection might take us. The final question from the chat box. Somebody asking how can they make a persuasive case for mixed methods? So how can we start the discussion in our systems and organisations that says actually we need a slightly more nuanced approach to this kind of work?
That's a really good question, and it's one I face in my career, even as I was doing my PhD in a medical school where most people are doing kind of epidemiological quantitative research. What's the point of my work? That's something I've had to just not develop a thick skin, but be aware that I will face that challenge, and that's okay when you're trying to create ripples towards a paradigm shift. I've put in a really seminal Plisek and Trish Greenhalgh. You may be aware of her wonderful work, but about complexity in healthcare, which I think may address some of the other questions the group may hold around, well, what are complex systems? How can we navigate that imperfection? So if I can answer that question around how to make a case through, well, what is good enough? Because I think that's how we started the talk. For me, at the core of what we do in health research and social research, social care research, is analysis and alleviation of risk. So risk to staff, patients, public, including vulnerable, underserved groups. So that's really important. We want to understand risk, and we often do that with clinical outcomes data, and that's crucial. That's important. That needs to, of course, carry on. But we also need to ask ourselves, if we push on trying to find something out, what is the risk then? So what's the risk to project delivery? What's the risk to people around us, key stakeholders? Is that worth the risk? Therefore, what should we be seeking to understand? And I think that's your rationale. This is what we want to understand. And we want to do that because we want to create transparency around public funds. I think this is what it comes down to. We have also identified loopholes to the solely metrics-based picture because they don't account for this, and this part of the story. For example, we're hearing this lack of engagement. So we've created this brand new service. People in Northwest London just aren't coming along, but it's great. We know it's great. But is it? There's a disconnect there. So the metrics won't tell us that story. We need to go at source and work with those groups. Mm-hmm. So it's about moving away from surveillance. Metrics are a carrot rather than a stick. We need to ensure that they correlate with what we're trying to achieve. So the questions we ask need to be rooted in what we are trying to achieve. And that's a really important rationale. Look, This is how we'll know that we are achieving our aims. And this is why people's thoughts, feelings, insights are important, because it sustains engagement. We can also use, say, the evaluation work to engage with communities, so it has a sustainable and a longer term effect. Post, tax year end, there's actually going to be a longer term impact. It's about the rationale that we're moving towards greater local ownership. We need to understand the data source so we can reference it back. So the data are trusted. That's really important. And also our data need to be used. So when I say data, I mean metrics and qualitative data. So we can bring them together as mixed methods. This is what stats are telling us. How do we understand this? Oh, well, our interviews told us this. This is why this is happening on the outcomes. But the last thing to say is dissemination is so important. As I was saying, with the commissioning cycle and the various commissioning pressures mean that there'll be a report, but there won't be that kind of really crucial comms, marketing, dissemination, engagement piece. And then data just kind of lying there gathering dust. How do we continue to use those data? How do we use them for engagement and understanding and trust building? How do we use them to make recommendations? And what's going to happen with those recommendations when we commission the initial work? Do we also put a budget aside for commissioning out, taking the recommendations forward? If we're not doing that, then well, what's the point of that piece of work? Well, it's ticking a box, but that's meaningless. That's not going to make us feel good about our work. So really, really crucial, and for sustainability and inbuilt monitoring loop. So your rationale could be, well, if we put into place particular approaches to, say, evaluating the work we do, and we give, say, the community ownership over that, we can continuously monitor. So there's a life cycle of the project where we need to ensure that there's monitoring and feedback for its sustainability. So I hope that helps. There's some ideas there for providing a rationale, but crucially, it's what I want to gather is in line with strategic aims, and by gathering what I'm suggesting, we'll know whether or not we've achieved them.
Yeah, thank you. As you were talking, I was reminded how important it is that we have a conversation that says, who's measuring, and can we speak to people about what would you like to measure? So quite a lot of organizational practice dictated from the centre about what gets measured. Sometimes it's external imperatives, sometimes it's within the organisation, but rarely do we talk to teams and others and say, what measurement would you like to do? So throughout my career, I remember talking to people that said quite categorically, we keep getting asked for data and we send it up the line. We don't know what they've asked for it. We don't know what they do with it. And actually, as I regularly say, we work in a corporation where over 50% of the people working for us are professionally qualified in some way. And yet, rarely do we talk to them and say, what thoughts do you have about how you would like your practice measured? So it strikes me, just to build off your very detailed answer, which was fantastically helpful. It's also just having a conversation with people to try and say, what would you like to see measured? So rather than make measurement something that people do to us, make measurement part of the practice, and that strikes me as quite a challenge. Maria, I'm going to call a halt there because we're 2 minutes before finishing. So I would just like to say thank you so much for taking time to join us today, for offering those insights, and a big thank you to the people that have joined us, and in particular the people who've stuck with us, which I think is a testimony to people's appetite for fresh thinking and new ideas. I have put your company website details in the chat box, which I hope people can follow through if they need to, because obviously people may have subsequent questions or want to follow up with you about practice. Just to finish and say thank you, I'm reminded of the book American Icon which is about Alan Mullally, who took over as chief executive of Ford at a time when the Ford Motor Company was on its knees. It was in a terrible state. And he arrived, and all the data that was given to him said it was wonderful, because people at various levels were fiddling with the data, crafting it for particular audiences, and trying to demonstrate how everything was fine. And eventually Mullally said, "This is nonsense. I know the company is a disaster at the moment, so stop giving me this data." That story always reminds me, even in the hard-nosed area of business, people recognise that data sometimes doesn't tell you what you think it does. And colleagues of mine, Megan Rates and John Higgins, who've done quite a lot of work about speaking up, they always say the chief exec has to accept they've got no real view of the world because everyone's giving them faulty data. So I think creating that bigger data source and thinking creatively about it is the way in which we can make a difference to that. So that's a rather preachy end to the session, but thank you for your time this afternoon, and I genuinely hope it's been useful for everybody. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, everyone.
I'll try and turn the recording around by this afternoon, so it should be up on the site by this afternoon. I just need to crack on.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. I think you can pause it as well.
Right. Oh yeah, I should probably just switch it off. You're right, reminding me. That's him.